Okay, and we're going to be kicking off. Welcome everyone to another Redline Twitter Space panel. This time talking about the recent uptick in tensions in the Nagorno Karabakh region, which is the disputed areas between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And we have a fantastic panel joining us today. We have James Lindsay, who is an absolutely fantastic analyst. Has a great YouTube channel as well, and is from every institution you could possibly name. Melvin, who's the head of RUSI and a very big expert on Russia and Russia's peripheral affairs, as well as Jake Hanarhan from Popular Front, who's a frontline journalist who's been operating in this region of the world for quite a long time now. And Jake, I'm going to throw to you first with this question. How impactful is this conflict on the region? You know, for people in Armenia and people in Azerbaijan, how seriously do they take the issue of Nagorno Karabakh?
Is it working?
You're all
Yeah.
good. You're coming through loud and
All
clear.
right, mate. Yeah, yeah. No, it's incredibly important. You know, it's one of the most important things I think for the Armenians, especially when you consider that there are still prisoners of war from Armenia stuck in Azerbaijan. Especially when you consider how brutal and visceral the war crimes carried out by the Azeri forces were during the war. In what was it, 2020 now. So I think, you know, a lot of that is still very fresh. When I was there, we interviewed a woman whose husband had basically been killed, and you know, they filmed it and posted it online, and she was desperate to stop her children seeing their father executed by Azeri forces. So it's one of them ones where, as you can imagine, it's still very, very close, very raw. And if you look back even further to the history, it's, you know, it's kind of like the heart of resistance for a lot of Armenians, I think.
So, Neil, why now? Why are these tensions kicking off? Is it just because the world is very distracted with Ukraine, or is there something that's been building to this for a while?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. No, good question. I mean, I think it's partly because of the instability caused by the Ukraine conflict, but fundamentally what it is that, I mean, there's a set of unresolved issues in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, going back to the late 80s and arguably even before that. And I mean, the latest round of fighting, the so-called Second Karabakh War, has not settled those. I mean, there's still unresolved issues. They are, of course, focused on what happens to what's left of Karabakh itself, now with Russian peacekeepers there, but Azerbaijan claiming ultimately sovereignty over that whole territory, but you know, with a large Armenian minority there, and Armenian forces still there. And then, of course, you know, the conflict itself in 2020 opened up a wider ambition now for Azerbaijan, which is to build land corridors, as they describe it, to Nakhchivan, this exclave, and open up sort of a wider access to Turkey. And so, I mean, all these issues have sort of shifted a little bit of the focus as a result of the last war, but resolved, and they're probably going to be unresolved as long as there are these disputes. And so, yeah, I think what happens is Azerbaijan continues to press on these questions. It feels it has the upper hand, and that's why we've seen this sort of incursion in the last couple of weeks into a village in Karabakh.
So, James, you were there. You were there in Armenia fairly recently. This conflict has been going on since the 90s, but obviously the 2020 conflict was very, very different to other ones, with Azerbaijan taking most of Artsakh under its control again. Why was the 2020 conflict so different to the previous skirmishes we'd seen since the breakup of the Soviet Union? Oh, I'll give you a second. Just put James back in. Okay, while we wait for James to come back, I'm going to go back to Jake. So, Jake, effectively, the Lukhan Corridor is an area you've talked about a few times. How crucial has Lukhan become for sort of the supply routes into Stepanakert and whatnot?
Well, I think the situation is, when you see it, it's surrounded essentially. You know, Stepanakert is surrounded. You know, Shushi is just up the road, and you can literally see huge Azerbaijani flags that they've obviously hung out on purpose just to kind of let them know, like, we're down the road. You know what I'm saying? So if the Russian peacekeepers were to stand down, Stepanakert would be surrounded very quickly militarily, and I think you need that kind of corridor. to at least make sure that goods can come in and out for the moment, whilst the war is not on for that region. But I mean, it's essential because the place is just surrounded. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Neil, obviously Russia right now is quite occupied with operations inside Ukraine. Do you think there is a worry by the Armenians that Russia will pull their peacekeepers out of this region and leave them open to these areas?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the 2020 war caused alarm in Armenia because they didn't get the support that I think they were hoping from Russia. I mean, Russia's been playing this game before the war of balancing between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and sort of using the status quo around the conflict to its own advantage, selling weapons to both sides. But of course, I mean, the Azeris called the Russians bluff during the conflict by basically forcing them to sort of carry on doing that role and not respond to Armenia's expectation that Russia would line up with them. So Armenia has been now sort of trying to diversify a bit its diplomacy. So we've seen this, the revival of the Turkish-Armenian dialogue on trying to settle the borders question. And a broader discussion about how Armenia can integrate across the region into regional sort of transport networks. And then, of course, depending on what happens in the Ukrainian conflict, there is concern about what this does mean for Russia's ultimate role. We've already seen Russia having to pull back forces that it has in occupied South Ossetia and Abkhazia to deploy them to Ukraine. There's some question about whether some equipment has been shipped already from Armenia to Ukraine. But at the moment, what Russia has done is it's been forced to actually increase its presence in Karabakh. So it's put more peacekeepers, so-called peacekeepers, in there to try to push back a bit this Azeri incursion into the Armenian village. So I think going forward, there are quite big questions raised about what this means for Russia as a security guarantor towards Armenia.
So, Jake, obviously, Neil was just talking about this here, but this corridor to Nakhchivan has been talked about for a very long time. So, for our audience, Nakhchivan is a part of Azerbaijan that is on the other side of Armenia. Do you think this corridor will ever go ahead, and will Armenia be happy for Azeri to be able to, freely transport troops across Armenian territory if they so choose?
Well, I mean, I think they'd be mad if they were happy, you know what I mean, to let that happen, because I think that very clearly spells out the end of like any real kind of maneuvering of Armenian forces in their own areas that they now still control, because Azerbaijan will be able to just freely go across the region however they want. But at the same time, I don't know if that will happen, because there's a very big difference between, for example, what the Armenians in Karabakh and Artsakh want versus the way the government has handled the situation. Now, not to say that the government wants to sell out Karabakh, but certainly there were some very big issues during the war, and from people I've spoken to, doesn't look like a lot of them have been solved. And I think he kind of just wants this problem to go away. So you never know what might happen, but I do think it would be very foolish for them to just go, yeah, have that, because inevitably it will be used to take the rest of the area, I imagine.
James, we've finally solved your problems. You're back on. So obviously, Russia does have good relations with both Armenia and Azerbaijan. They have been selling weapons to both. With this conflict ratcheting up and Russia not in the strengthening position that they were a little while ago, do you think they will pick a side in this, or they'll try and effectively stay out of it like they did in 2020, James?
In what sense? I mean, Russia sort of, or the sides, if you like, sort of picking a side in the case of Russia, Ukraine. Sorry, I've had a few technical problems that have created problems.
That's all right. Can you hear us, James?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. You're all good. So, yes, will Russia end up picking a side in this, and supporting one side over the other, or frankly, try and keep with the 2020 path of effectively trying to stay a little bit clear of it?
Well, I mean, I think the problem, of course, is that we are in such a different place at the moment, aren't we, from where we were even 6 weeks ago. That the war obviously in Ukraine hasn't gone the way that Russia was expecting. I think it's really throwing open all sorts of difficulties and questions at the moment. I mean, there have been these reports in the past few days that South Ossetia is now considering sort a request to join Russia. So I think, we're seeing all sorts of shifts going on, which make it very, very difficult to tell, because it'll also be the case that, what's going on in Baku and what's going on in Yerevan about their wider, the calculations for their future as well. And I think Russia will just be desperately looking to maintain its relevance in the Caucasus at the moment. And so, Moscow will be carefully weighing up, I should imagine, or as much bandwidth as it's got to be carefully weighing up how it should play this. And I think there will be a real concern that, that both Armenia and Azerbaijan might now be starting to look more sort of towards the West in some way or another.
Neil, with the current situation unfolding in Ukraine, do you think Azerbaijan feels like it has a free hand in the Caucasus at the moment, that Russia just simply doesn't have the current bandwidth to really put any pressure on Azerbaijan at the moment?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just before the conflicts in Ukraine started, Russia and Azerbaijan signed this document. It's a sort of an alliance document, and I mean, there was a feeling this was part of the the post 2020 Karabakh conflict new diplomacy of Russia, in which it's trying to reposition itself from this former balancing role on a number of tracks. One is through the 3+3, or in fact 3+2, because George just wanted to join it, but 3+3 platform, where they would, together with Turkey and Iran and the three South Caucasus countries, sort of set up a regional forum for these issues. Secondly, was to try to pull Azerbaijan back into the Russian fold a bit through this agreement, and then sort of develop the whole transport infrastructure question. I mean, I think that a couple of things now because of the war. I mean, it is interesting that Azerbaijan has chosen this moment to move in. It does seem a very deliberate strategy to move in and challenge Russia, and then Russia's pushed back quite hard and has said that Azerbaijan is violating the trilateral ceasefire agreement, from 2020. But they don't seem to be willing to pull back at this stage. They also seem to have possibly used drones and have allegedly killed 3 Armenian sort of troops in Karabakh. So it does seem part of a strategy, but as I said before, it's a wider strategy by Azerbaijan, because I think we have to also look at the border clashes that have been happening since 2020 between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which I think are tied into what we were just talking about, this ambition to build a land corridor, a transport corridor from Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan, and really just to push Armenia back. I mean, Armenia is in a very vulnerable situation, and so Azerbaijan is looking for opportunities. And with Russia distracted in Ukraine, I think there's also going to be big questions about what resources Russia's going to have for the South Caucasus after the Ukraine conflict. I mean, the sanctions are obviously devastating their economy. Their military capabilities are being denuded quite substantially, and just the bandwidth to deal with the complex dynamics in the South Caucasus are not really there in Moscow at the moment. So my suspicion is that they've decided to put a bit of pressure on, and to keep that pressure on, and this is why we see them doing this at this moment.
So if you just joined us, this is a Redline live Twitter Space panel focusing on the recent uptick in tensions in the Nagorno Karabakh region between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And joining us on the panel today is Jake Hanarhan, a frontline journalist who's been spending a lot of time focused on the region. James Kerr-Lindsay, who runs the fantastic YouTube channel James Kerr-Lindsay, and Neil Melvin, the head of RUSI. So Jake, you've obviously spent a lot of time with the Armenian troops there. Do you think there's the appetite still there for a fight if Azerbaijan does choose to escalate here after the pretty harsh defeats of 2020? Are the Armenians willing to go and fight again?
I mean, they're definitely willing to fight. We met young men that were like 18, 19, who were like, on the front line. We went to one space where you could literally just see the Azeri troops on the hill above us, like with your bare eyes. It wasn't like, oh, they're miles and miles away. They're very close. And even then they were taking pot shots, even in the alleged time of the ceasefire. The Armenian troops are definitely willing to, we saw that just seeing how many of them died for the region during the war in 2020, despite being massively outgunned, massively outnumbered. Just so many young men dying. When we went to the one of the graveyards in Stepanakert, it's just brutal. You've got on it's like steps. So at the top of the step, you've got all the men that died in the 90s, and then as it goes down, there's just all these young men that died more recently. There were fresh graves being dug because there were more bodies coming. So there were definitely there's definitely that will to fight. But I think Neil's right in the sense that Azerbaijan is just going to use this now whilst everyone is kind of distracted. And you got to remember when the world wasn't distracted, when this war was happening, a lot of people didn't care about the situation. Azerbaijan, it's not an opinion, it's objective fact. Azerbaijan were carrying out and filming extremely brutal war crimes, cutting heads off, dozens and dozens of videos of them just executing people. The worst I saw, there was an old man, they cut off his head and placed it on a bloated pig that they'd also killed. And the world was just like, you know what I mean? Wasn't really focused the same way. Even reporters were like, oh, there's war crimes on both sides, which was really not contextual, because you're talking a couple on the Armenian side versus dozens and dozens of videos on the other. So I think right now would unfortunately be the perfect time for Azerbaijan to do something horrible in the region, and the world just wouldn't care, I think. And the UN is like, oh, well, it belongs to Azerbaijan, despite, the churches, the Armenian churches in the region being a lot older than the UN. But I do think that, the Armenian troops, they definitely have the will to fight, because it's more than just politics for them. It's their homeland. It's they've already seen some of their ancient artifacts destroyed in the areas that Azerbaijan has taken over. But I think it comes down to a lot more than the will. You know what I mean? There's a lot more to it than that.
So we have our DMs open at the moment. So if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to DM the red line, and we'll be putting those questions to our fantastic panelists. But James, I'm going to throw this one to you. We have seen the gas pipeline that supplies the majority of heating into Nagorno Karabakh cut off. And we've seen recent escalations, particularly the fact that the official Facebook page of Nagorno Karabakh was taken over, and they changed their profile picture to an Azeri flag and put a message up saying that all Armenians should leave Nagorno Karabakh in 68 hours, or 168 hours, sorry. Why is this? Are they hoping that Armenians will leave peacefully so there isn't a conflict, or is there some sort of ulterior motive to all of this?
Well, I mean, look, we know that the conflict in 2020 was stopped at the last moment. And I think there would have been a lot of unhappiness in Baku about that. They felt that they were on the verge of a significant victory. Russia stepped in at the last moment, and it was completely opportunistic by Moscow. I mean, I was in Yerevan in December, and, the Armenians are in a very, very difficult position now, because they know that their tenuous link to Nagorno Karabakh completely relied on those Russian peacekeepers. They felt very, very let down that Russia only stepped in at the last moment. And literally, we are talking about hours. Had the Russians held off, then it's highly likely that the Azerbaijani forces would have overrun Nagorno Karabakh completely. And of course, Azerbaijan itself, I think, feels, very, very unhappy about this, angry about this. There was this chance to get back all of that territory as they see it as theirs. And that was thwarted at the last moment because, as they saw it, Moscow was obviously quite clearly this powerhouse. And so I think, yes, what we are seeing now is Azerbaijan thinking, well, you know what, Moscow has been exposed for being much, much weaker than they expected. I thought the point about signing a strategic agreement just before the war in Ukraine was really very, very important and very telling, of course, wasn't it? It was this sort of sense that Azerbaijan just, this was cementing what it saw as, Moscow as this great sort of international power. And that has been thrown to one side. And so I think, absolutely there will be the sense in Baku that this is an ideal moment now, as as Jake was pointing out, that while international attention is on Ukraine, to move in. And we have seen other very prominent cases where countries have done this, have marched in and seized back all their sovereign territory. I mean, obviously we had the case of Crimea in 1995, where Croatia sort of moved in under Operation Storm and ended the attempt by ethnic Serbs in Croatia to establish their own breakaway state. And of course, we have the case in the late 2000s, first decade, of Sri Lanka, where Sri Lankan forces moved in and ended the efforts by Tamil separatists. So we have some very, very clear examples of this. And I think Baku will be looking to what's going on at the moment and thinking this is our ideal opportunity. And obviously, if they can get the Armenians who remain there to move out peacefully, all's the better. But I think, there is going to be a lot of worry that we might see something far more significant emerge in the next few days.
Neil, obviously you're an expert. You've seen a lot of these conflicts in a lot of these regions. What are the signs we should be looking for, that a conflict might be gearing up, they might be ready to go? Is there anything that, you in particular are watching in the Caucasus quite closely at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment it's more a kind of a probing operation, to be honest, by the Azeris. I mean, of course, that they may be preparing something bigger, but I mean, the Russian peacekeeping force is a substantial block on major military action. But I think, unfortunately, what I think is sort of emerging is that we're seeing preparations possibly for a third round. Since the war, of course, Azerbaijan has been rebuilding lots of the infrastructure from the formerly occupied territories and linking up to Azerbaijan to parts of Karabakh it couldn't get to, such as Shusha and so on. What it seems to be pushing for at the moment with this latest incursion in Karabakh is its argument that the ceasefire agreement that James was just talking about indicated that Armenian military forces would be withdrawn from Karabakh, and it's saying that hasn't happened, and this must now happen. So, of course, this is stripping away another sort of layer of protection. And so, if the ultimate aim is then to take back full control of Karabakh and possibly even displace the Armenian population, ethnic cleansing, we can't rule it out, then it seems to be a step-by-step strategy to kind of do that. And of course, the key moment is going to be when it comes the time to renew or end the current Russian peacekeeping operation. In the ceasefire agreement, they agreed a 5-year mandate for that force. And so I think this comes back to this question about what is Russia's long-term capabilities and commitments to the region, and how will they be able to remain there. But I think the other country that we need to also factor into this is Turkey. Turkey was one of the big winners, it was felt, I think, from the Karabakh crisis. It handled it, the Second War handled it quite effectively, but was then cut out to some degree from the post-conflict politics by Russia's maneuvering. And it does have a lot of leverage on Azerbaijan. So while it wants to keep pressure up in the region, I don't think it really wants another full-scale war at this moment. And so I think Turkey is playing a bit of a calming role on the potential for a return to full-scale conflict.
So we do have our DMs open at the moment here at the Red Line. So if you have any questions for our panel, feel free to send them through. And this comes for Jake. You were obviously sitting there in the region. How are both sides viewing the Russians? Do the Armenians have a positive view of the Russian peacekeepers, and from your time there, how do you think the Azeris are viewing the Russian peacekeepers there?
That's a good question. I mean, when we were there, the Armenians were kind of like, look, we're glad they're here because it's, they're not idiots. They're smart people. They're like, look, we're glad they're here because if they weren't, then it's very clear the whole region would have been overrun by now. And at least whilst they're there kind of breaking up this road from that road, we can kind of operate a little bit normally now that things are on a ceasefire. But they certainly weren't in love with the Russians. And I know a lot of Armenians are very much not happy that Armenian troops, for example, were deployed to Kazakhstan as a part of that alliance. But at the end of the day, they know that no one else is helping them, and they just have to kind of do it. I mean, if they turn around and say, no, we're not going to do this, Russia will just be like, okay, well, then we won't protect you in Artsakh or Karabakh. Like, it's very simple, I think. And that's why people playing these very silly political games of, Armenians support, the Russian attack on Ukraine. It's like, no, they support not having their whole area overrun, and they're just glad they've got some help that they can do. Obviously, the Azerbaijanis, they don't like Russia because they, like James said, they kind of stopped them at the very last moment. But at the same time, Russia is playing both games. It's been arming both sides for a long time. So I think overall, I got the kind of vibe that people on the ground were like, look, we're glad they're here, but there was no real, gushing love for them. They didn't feel like they'd been saved, certainly not. And I think they were very aware that Russia hadn't stepped in when they could have. and saved a lot more of the area. So I think a lot of people had a kind of a rude awakening that Russia is just playing the chess game there, like they are all over the place. You know what I mean?
So, James, if there is an offensive by the Azeris, are they likely to just stick to the Karabakh region, or frankly, they may actually cross the border now, having seen what Russia's done, and take southern bits of Armenia to secure that corridor to Najivan?
Well, I mean, you know, there will be those in Baku who I think would want to push in that direction, but you know, I would hope and expect that saner heads would prevail, because all that would do is simply flip one problem that Azerbaijan had for many decades, where Armenia was considered by the international community to be in occupation, a part of what was sovereign Azerbaijani territory, for a problem where I think it would become fairly clear that much of the international community would argue that Azerbaijan is now in occupation of Armenian sovereign territory. So that would create a long-term problem for Azerbaijan. So one would hope that even if they did decide that they wanted to take this step of taking back the entire territory of Nagorno Karabakh and putting it firmly under its sovereign control, that it wouldn't then look to expand into Armenian territory. The problem, of course, is that if it does that, it may make it absolutely impossible for Armenia to continue on with those discussions about creating that land corridor. And you know, I think the point that Neil raised also, I mean, you know, Turkey is incredibly important about this, and it has gone relatively unnoticed that there has been a noticeable warming of relations between Ankara and Yerevan in recent months, that, you know, real steps have been taken towards normalization. So Turkey, as part of a wider step to improve its international relations, might again sort of look at everything going on, and will have to make a calculation. I think it will certainly say, do not take territory in Armenia if you do decide to go on with this, because, you know, we've already, as Ankara, taken a strong position about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And I think the international community will simply be, you know, no one's in any mood to see other countries sort of taking sovereign territory. So I think Baku will have to really, really carefully consider its options if it does decide that it wants to launch a major military offensive.
So one of the major sort of comforting factors here was that there were Russian observers and there were Turkish observers. So, Neil, are the Turkish observers still there, or are they actually being pulled to the Black Sea to worry about Ukraine more? You know, is there still this Turkish oversight on the Azeri side of the conflict?
To be honest, I'm not sure what's happened. I haven't seen any evidence that the Turkish monitoring facility has changed. I mean, it's quite a small operation that is a distance from Karabakh. And as I said, I mean, the key thing for the Turks coming out of the conflict was to get that center. I mean, the Russians are quite resistant to the idea. They've tended to play a fairly low-key role in it. But I do think that, you know, Turkey has this dual track now, because it got cut out a bit of the post-conflict settlement. It's opened up to Armenia, and it wants to kind of use that, I think, as a way to try and re-enter the region. So I think it would be reluctant to see Azerbaijan escalate the conflict. And of course, Azerbaijan is quite reliant on some key Turkish military technologies, particularly the drones, but also their wider diplomatic support. And there may also be a sort of a technical solution to this issue of how to link up Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan, because Turkey also sees this as an important, because it's part of a sort of in the nationalist discourse in Turkey, that a revival of the pan-Turkic links to Central Asia by building these transport corridors. The core issue, of course, is that Azerbaijan and Turkey want the free flow of goods and people across Armenia on the railway and the roads. And Armenia is very reluctant not to have a lot of border checks. I mean, basically checks all along that transport corridor, because they feel that they would risk losing their sovereign control. But I mean, I'm old enough to remember things like when we used to go to West Berlin during the Cold War, when you would have trains that could be sealed to transit the East German part of the territory before you get to Berlin. So I mean, you could have sealed trains. You could have a Russia-Turkish role in helping to monitor that land route. And of course, there is the broader issue, which is that Azerbaijan calls it a corridor, but Armenia and I think others in the region are arguing that this is part of an opening up of South Caucasus in a regional transport network. And so to focus less on the corridor idea and more about a general opening up as part of a trust building mechanism, I think may be the way forward.
So, Jake, do you think the West, you have seen NATO and the Western countries get unprecedentedly involved in Ukraine? It's been front page news for a fair while now. If this conflict breaks out between Armenia and Azerbaijan, do you think there'll be any interest from the West, or frankly, much like 2020's conflict, it will just kind of go under the radar for most of the Western press?
Well, I think it will go under the radar. I mean, it went under the radar in 2020. It will go under the radar even more because of the situation in Ukraine. However, I don't really buy this thing of, oh, well, the West doesn't care about the rest of the world because they're focused on Ukraine. I mean, it's a massive war in the middle of Europe. Of course, Europeans are going to be more focused on a war that is closer to them than one that isn't. That's not like any political thing. That's just common sense. You know what I mean? People are working their ass off, 40-hour work weeks. They're obviously going to care more about a war that is a lot closer to them than one that isn't. However, this so-called international community, whatever that really means, I think they could do a hell of a lot more to focus on this. It's one of these ones where people are very quick to talk about humanitarian issues when it kind of suits what they're doing. But there wasn't that much talk of the humanitarian issues for the Armenians. And I really think that it's quite disturbing that everybody talks about this, not on this panel, but just in general, that people talk about the geopolitical side of things without looking a little bit closer. Azerbaijan is an openly authoritarian country. I think even the UN has said that they highly suspect that the elections were rigged. If you just look up the Azerbaijan laundromat, the whole country is corrupt to its core. And, people were getting arrested and sent to prison, Azerbaijanis, for being against the war in 2020. And then you're talking about people getting military medals and awards for cutting people to bits with axes. That actually happened. And people getting medals for playing football with somebody's head, which happened to a 19-year-old Yazidi Armenian who was beheaded by Azeri troops. So it's one of these ones where I think probably people should be really focused on that, because some very, very serious war crimes will happen again. Not to say that, oh, the international community doesn't do anything. They do. But I just think that a little bit more should be focused on the people on both sides. You know what I'm saying? It's the same. Like, there's a lot of Azerbaijanis as well that don't want this. And like I said, they end up in prison. So it's one of them ones where I think there will be less focus. I just hope that, there's a little bit more of a humanitarian focus on this, as we've seen in Ukraine, which is obviously good. But maybe let's kind of, broaden that out and look at it at other things, because even though it's over there, it will affect things over here. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So moving to James now, obviously this is another question that's come from our DMs, but there have been clashes between France and Azerbaijan over this issue. Do you think this is going to render the Minsk process completely obsolete, or any sort of peace process obsolete, if frankly, the border integrity is not observed on this one?
Well, it puts us in very, very interesting territory. I mean, essentially, look, if it's the case that Azerbaijan pushes ahead and decides, right, okay, this is our opportunity, we're going to take control of Nagorno Karabakh in entirety, it effectively ends the issue. I mean, that's the stark reality. And the international community, I think, will probably, say, look, if this can be done with as little bloodshed as possible, and any civilian casualties can be kept to a minimum. I think we've seen in previous situations, again, I mean, Croatia was a very good example of this, where there was actually a sigh of relief, right? Okay, this is a problem solved. And I think attention will then turn to saying to Armenia, look, you know what, it's over. We feel your pain. We know where you're coming from. We know that this is incredibly important, but it's done. What we can do is now sort of look at how we form a proper process of reconciliation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and you're just going to have to live with it and get on with it. And I think it will then, be considered to join a whole bunch of other countries around the world, which will sort of cry into their beers at night and sort of say, say, this is unredeemed territory. There's a lot of other countries around the world which, have lost conflicts and found themselves in that situation. So I think, if we're to talk, from a very pragmatic political point of view, I think, as I say, a lot of countries will look at this and hope, right, okay, well, this has effectively solved the problem. So yes, I mean, if it goes ahead, then we're in a very different situation. But if things stay as they are, actually, it does mean that some sort of settlement is going to have to be found at some point, and that's going to be a very, very difficult process. So again, I think as awful as it sounds, I think there will be a few be thinking, maybe it's time that we just rip the bandage off this problem once and for all.
Neil, what do you think Armenia should be doing in this scenario? What do you think is the best path for them forward?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Armenia is in a very tough situation. Its main plan, which was to obviously rely on Russia to supply them with some modern weaponry, or at least the most modern weaponry it could, and to make that core security relationship, didn't protect them in 2020. But relying on that has also prevented them diversifying. And of course, famously, that security relationship was used by Russia to stop Armenia signing the free trade agreement with the European Union. I think with a pretty weak hand, the best bet is to try and diversify Armenia's contacts. So certainly try to move forward on this, resolving the long-standing issues with Turkey, get the border open, try and build connections there, try and reach out to the Europeans and the Americans. I mean, I think one of the interesting things coming out of Ukraine is going to be now what the transatlantic community is going to do in the post-Soviet space. And prior to Ukraine, we were seeing the gradual death of European security, and the Minsk process was part of that. I mean, there just wasn't, frankly, an interest really in the South Caucasus, and indeed even perhaps more widely to Ukraine and Belarus in the transatlantic community. Now, the Ukraine crisis is going to, I think, lead to a rethinking not just on Russia policy, but also how we deal with the neighbors of Russia. We've allowed Russia to really take over in some degrees in the South Caucasus, and France, as the only sort of European in the Minsk process, also has been quite disengaged. Are we going to see a return to that? And I think if there is going to be a discussion, Armenia should try to put itself into that framework. One of the issues I think are also in a discussion, which is going to make things more difficult, is the whole energy security discussion. We're very busy now cutting ourselves off from Russian supplies, but of course we're desperately looking for alternatives, and so Caspian gas is being reconsidered, and that puts up Azerbaijan squarely in the frame of how to counter Russia, which is going to further strengthen its hand, and Armenia is going to have to come up with some answers to that. So I think given that weak hand, those are its most likely options. It hasn't, to be honest, earned many friends in terms of the way it's approached the Ukraine crisis. Of course, it voted with Russia in the Council of Europe debate about the future of Russia. It's been at best neutral in some of the UN debates. So I think some kind of better signaling from Armenia that it's open to having a wider relationship with the Europeans is probably the right thing to do now.
Jake, we've got about 5 minutes left on this conversation, but I'm going to throw this question to you. What do you think the Armenians should be doing in this? Should they be trying to encourage people to leave the area, or to try and solve and stop bloodshed going ahead, or frankly, this is Armenian territory and the people who are born will likely want to stay here to the end?
I mean, I don't think it's my place or anyone who isn't an Armenian's place to say what the Armenians should be doing. That's up to them. They can do their own thing and determine their own futures, of course. But in terms of what maybe I would expect the government to be doing, I think Pashinyan particularly has already failed a lot of the young men and women out on the front lines. I saw that when I went there. They didn't even... You're talking very rudimentary things like they didn't even have the correct winter wear. They didn't have the correct boots, lack of ammunition. So I think really that at the end of the day, this is probably coming. And like the other two lads have said, this is not going to end well for Armenia. I think that's just kind of obvious. They're in a rock and a hard place. At the end of the day, the government can do everything it can to just make sure people are ready and find alternatives. When the gas is put off, there needs to be some kind of, I don't know, some kind of aid sent up there. You know what I mean? It very much, when I was there, it felt very much like Armenia was very separate from Artsakh, from Karabakh. It didn't feel like the government was that engaged with them. And certainly it didn't feel like the government cared much about the young men on the front line. It was abysmal, some of the conditions, which is why they got very angry with me. The government did that. I went to some of the front lines there because they were like, don't go. And then we saw it and it was like, that's why don't go. You're in the middle of a ceasefire. No one has told them to dig deeper trenches. No one has brought them winter coats. There were literal charities bringing them equipment, that were nothing to do with the government. A lot of the money raised for Armenia at the start of the war kind of vanished, and all of a sudden a lot of the politicians got pay rises, So I think really, whilst I don't want to say the Armenians should or shouldn't be doing anything, one thing I definitely think could happen is that the government cares a little bit more about the people there. Yes, it's nice to get the negotiations. Yes, I agree with that needs to be sorted out because, things are going to end badly either way. But I think the government could do more and engage in the people in Karabakh and, the Armenians that are stuck there and helping them a bit more. I do know that, some of that is happening, but I would argue it's not happening quick enough.
And my last question, James, to sort of bring us to the end of this, if the Armenians are throwing everything they can at the wall at the moment. They're trying to normalize relations with Ankara. They're trying to call out to friends around the world. If they were to go to Baku and say, "Look, we'll give you we'll allow armored trains or corridors of sealed off trains to cross Armenian territory," do you think that's enough to prevent this conflict sparking up, or frankly, the die's been cast and Azerbaijan is already on that path now?
It's a very difficult one because again, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's this sense that I think Baku would like that land corridor, but I think there might be a sort of a sense that again there will be those in Baku who will be saying, look, it'll be a setback if we take back Nagorno Karabakh, but the trend is heading in a particular direction, and yes, it might make relations a little bit more difficult for a few years. But once we've got this problem of Nagorno Karabakh out of the way, then we can start then talking to Yerevan, and we'll see if we can work with the Turks as well. If they reach out to Yerevan, then maybe we can start to see something move. So could well be that argument that would be coming out to say, look, we should just go for it, and we'll fix things later. The other alternative, of course, but it is incredibly unpalatable for many Armenians even now, is for Armenia to go to Baku and say, look, we know the game's up. We can't sustain the idea of an independent Nagorno Karabakh, but it is still important for us to be able to have some sort of ongoing Armenian presence in this territory. It's very, very significant for us, culturally, historically. Can we discuss some sort of autonomy arrangement? And we will then, in return for that, repudiate the idea that this is Armenian territory. We won't support the idea of an independent Nagorno Karabakh, but is there some way that we can reach some sort of compromise deal? And the problem, if we're to be very fair, is that Armenia hasn't wanted to do that in the past. And of course, this is not to say, I mean, the Azerbaijani government has been absolutely adamant, we will not allow any sort of autonomy. That's out of the question. We won't accept it, and even reluctant to have any sort of cultural autonomy, let alone political. But one senses that this could be an alternative, and maybe there is a chance as a last minute sort of thing for Yerevan to go to Baku and make that offer, but it would actually have to be also tied in with a very, very clear statement that Armenia absolutely respects the territorial integrity of Republic of Azerbaijan, including the area that's Nagorno Karabakh, and that's going to be a very, very difficult message, I think, for many Armenians to hear. And could put the leadership in a lot of problems. So, one would hope that there is still room for a political settlement on all of this, but it isn't looking desperately positive just as things stand.
So I want to say a huge thanks to everyone who tuned in for this this live Twitter space. I want to thank our panelists, Jake Hanarhan from Popular Front, James Kerr-Lindsay from James Kerr-Lindsay, and Neil Melvin from RUSI. You're absolutely fantastic to have all of you on this panel, and big fans of all three of your work. If you want to check out more of our stuff on Nagorno-Karabakh, we did do a big piece on this just after the 2020 conflict, and it pretty much laid out most of the groundwork for what was going to happen today. Otherwise, this interview will be on YouTube in the next couple of days. You can check out our stuff there. And thanks to everyone who sent questions through as well. We'll be doing another one of these panels on a different subject in the next few weeks. But thank you so much for everyone listening, and thank you so much to our panelists as well.
Cheers, mate. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.